Morning, sir. Can you please?
Sorry.
No, I just wanted to tell you that can you please mute your
No,
disturbance is coming.
I'm unable to see the live on YouTube option on the more.
Website it is coming live, sir.
Sorry. Sorry, is it already live?
Yes, sir. It is already live.
Sorry. I can't. The more app tab does not show live on YouTube. Nandakishore, what is the issue?
Sir, he's unable to join, sir. He's clicking the link. He's telling it's unable to join. I have sent him again the link through the mail. 1 minute, sir. It will be over. Karthik? I think he has joined, sir. Karthik? Karthik? Karthik, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Have you joined?
Yes, sir. Just now, sir.
Yeah. Have you joined through phone or laptop?
Laptop itself, sir.
I think there is some problem with your laptop. Screen is also not clear.
Okay, sir. Sir,
Yes, Chip Karthik.
sir, are you able to see my screen, sir?
As of now, no, Karthik.
Sir, 1 minute, sir.
It's stuck up. The screen is stuck up. It is showing you and Harini.
Sir?
Yeah, it's now visible.
Okay, sir. Can I go ahead, sir, now?
Sir, Srinivas, sir, is it okay, sir?
Yes, Kishore.
Yeah.
Please
Karthik,
go ahead.
start.
Sir, can I go ahead, sir?
Yes, Karthik.
Yes,
Start the class.
Yes, sir. So today, good morning, everyone. Today my topic is basics of antibiotics. So I am going to cover the introduction for antibiotics, classification of antibiotics, mechanism of action of antibiotics, spectrum of activity of antibiotics, pharmacokinetics and dynamics, and killing characteristics of antibiotics. So,
Once, Karthik, make your screen enlarge. Make it full screen.
Yes, sir.
And mute your video.
So now is it okay, sir?
Yeah, carry on.
Yes, sir. So antibiotics are chemical substances produced by various microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, and actinomyces that have the capacity to either kill the bacteria or inhibit the bacteria. They are either naturally produced, semi-synthetic, and or else synthetically produced. They have bactericidal or bacteriostatic activity. They either kill the bacteria or inhibit the proliferation of the bacteria. Antibiotics will not cause the infections caused by the viruses. So how to improve the probability of positive outcomes. So we have a window of opportunity with infection and sepsis with early recognition treatment of infection with antibiotics. It can be it can be subsided, and selection of appropriate antibiotics is necessary. Optimization of dose using pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic principles and taking into account the killing characteristics of antibiotics is important for the good outcomes to come. So what is an ideal antibiotic? Ideal antibiotic is most selective, most effective to the infected microorganisms, most bactericidal.
Your slides are not moving. Put them on slideshow and your slides are not moving.
Sir. Yes, sir. Sir, now is it okay, sir?
Your slides are not moving. Reshare the presentation. Yeah, now they are moving.
Yes, sir.
Put it in the slideshow mode.
Yes, sir. I have put it. So, what's the ideal antibiotic? It should be most selective, most effective to the infected organisms, more bactericidal at the site of action, and antibacterial effect is not interfered by the fluids, exudates, and plasma as in abscess and in some tissues. There should be minimal toxicity, and resistance should develop slowly. It should be given by any route, and it should be cost effective. So, classification of antibiotics. Coming to the topic. So, antibiotics are classified based on taking into several factors in consideration. So on the basis of chemical structures, they are classified on the basis of origin, on the basis of spectrum of activity, on the basis of mode of action, on the basis of their effect of their activity, and on the basis of route of administration. And so here we take consideration. We take consideration of the mode of action of an antibiotic. So classification of antibiotics on the basis of chemical structure. They are either carbohydrate containing antibiotics like pure saccharide, streptozotocin, amino glycoside like streptomycin, and nitric oxide glycosides like chromomycin, macrocyclic lactone containing antibiotics like macrolides, quinolone containing like fluoroquinolones, nitrogen containing heterocyclic antibiotics like beta lactams. They will have a beta lactam ring in their chemical structure, and oxygen containing heterocyclic antibiotics like cycloserine, alicyclic aromatic and aliphatic antibiotics are there, and peptide antibiotics like polymyxin and bezafibrine. And classification of antibiotics on the basis of origin. Microbial origin are from bacteria, fungus, and actinomycetes. From the bacterial origin, Bacillus polymyxa will produce polymyxin, Chromobacterium violaceum will produce bacitracin, Micromonospora species will produce gentamicin. From the fungal origin, Penicillium notatum will produce penicillin, and Cephalosporin species produces cephalosporins. Actinomycetes origin, Streptomyces griseus produces streptomycin, Streptomyces venezuela, erythraeus, and Mediterranean. These all produce antibiotics. And semisynthetic antibiotics are amoxicillin, ampicillin, doxycycline, tetracycline, and sulfonamides. And synthetic antibiotics, chloramphenicol it's initially synthesized from the microbial origin, and then later it's produced chemically. So classification of antibiotics on the base of activity, range of activity. So narrow spectrum, moderate spectrum, narrow broad spectrum, and extended spectrum of antibiotics. So narrow spectrum have coverage of fewer microorganisms like macrolides and polymyxins. Moderate spectrum has good gram-positive coverage and some activity of UTI causing gram-negative organisms like aminoglycosides and sulfonamides. Narrow broad spectrum antibiotics active against gram-positive and gram-negative like beta-lactam. Broad spectrum, they have gram-positive, gram-negative coverage except the Pseudomonas and mycobacteria. Extended broad spectrum has coverage against the Pseudomonas and mycobacteria. So coming to the antimicrobial antibiotics, isoniazid, rifampicin, ethambutol, and pyrazinamide. These are activity against antitubercular, mycobacterium tuberculosis. So classification of antibiotics on the basis of mode of action, on which part of the bacterial cell it acts. So inhibitor of cell wall synthesis, inhibitor of protein synthesis, inhibitor of nucleic acid synthesis, inhibitor of ribosomal synthesis of proteins, inhibitor of folic acid synthesis, inhibitor of cytoplasmic membrane. So, and on the basis of their activity against the bacteria, whether it's a bactericidal, it will kill the bacteria, or whether it's bacteriostatic, it will inhibit the proliferation of the bacteria. So on the basis of this, they are classified, and the classification of antibiotics on the route of administration, whether they are given parenteral or whether they are given orally. So this is a picture which depicts an overall view of the antibiotics. So here you can see that dark green colored labeled pictures of antibiotics are bactericidal, and light green color labeled antibiotics are bacteriostatic. So we have beta-lactams, aminoglycosides, glycopeptides, quinolines, streptogramins, and linezolids. These are bactericidal, and chloramphenicol, oxazolidone.
Karthik, recheck your slides. They are not moving. Your slides are stuck up at one.
Yes, sir. Sir, now is it okay, sir?
Yes.
Yes. So, on this slide, we can see the overview of different classes of antibiotics. So dark green color labeled antibiotics are bactericidal, and light green color labeled antibiotics are bacteriostatic. So beta-lactams, aminoglycosides, quinolones, streptogramins, and lipopeptides are bactericidal. Chloramphenicol, oxalidones, sulfonamides, tetracyclines, and macrolides are bacteriostatic antibiotics. So coming to the mechanism of action of antibiotics, so in this picture, we can clearly see the action of different antibiotics at different sites of the bacteria. So cell wall synthesis inhibitors are beta-lactams, which includes penicillins, cephalosporins, carbapenems, and monobactams, bacitracin, vancomycin. These all act on the cell wall. They destroy the cell wall of the bacteria. And quinolones and novobiosins, they act on the DNA replication. They further inhibit the recoiling of the DNA for mRNA synthesis, and then does inhibit the bacterial proliferation. And RNA elongation is prevented by actinomycin. DNA-dependent RNA polymerase is inhibited by rifampin and streptoviracins. Protein synthesis is inhibited by affecting the ribosomes. 50S subunit is affected by erythromycin, chloramphenicol, clindamycin, and lincomycins. And 30S subunits of ribosomes are affected by aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, and nitrofurands. And tRNA is affected by mucin and puromycin. And cytoplasmic membrane structure is affected by polymyxins and daptomycin. So by this picture, we can get a clear idea of what antibiotics act at on what part of the bacteria, and thus have their bactericidal or bacteriostatic effect. So this is a tabular form of site of mechanism of action of antibiotics. So mycolic acid synthesis inhibitors are isoniazid. So mycolic acid, which is present in the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, are inhibited. The mycolic acid synthesis is inhibited by isoniazid. So beta-lactams. These are a group of antibiotics which are penicillins, carbapenems, and cephalosporins. These have beta-lactam ring in common. So it includes penicillins, all types of penicillins like narrow spectrum penicillins, aminopenicillins, carbapenicillins, iridopenicillins, and carbapenems, which includes meropenem, imipenem, doripenem, and ertapenem, and cephalosporins. So these all antibiotics inhibit the cell wall synthesis. So by inhibiting the cell wall synthesis, they make the bacteria from impermeable to semi-permeable, thus causing the fluid shifts by the osmotic gradient, and thus the bacterial cell wall gets swollen, and then cell membrane rupture occurs, and thus killing the bacteria. So it's a bactericidal antibiotic. Aminoglycosides. So aminoglycosides includes streptomycin, neomycin, kanamycin, tobramycin, and gentamicin. Semisynthetic are amikacin derived from kanamycin, netlimycin derived from sisomycin. So these antibiotics irreversibly bind to the 30S ribosomal subunit and thus cause mRNA decoding errors and thus producing defective proteins, causing the killing effect of the bacteria. So macrolides, they are bacteriostatic. They reversibly bind to the 23S subunit of the 50S ribosomal subunits and thus block the translocation reaction of the polypeptide chain elongation. Thus, protein synthesis is inhibited, and so it's basically a RNA-dependent protein synthesis inhibitor. And tetracyclines, they are bacteriostatic. They also bind to the 30S subunit of the ribosome, thus inhibiting the protein synthesis. Linezolid, it's a oxazolidone class of antibiotic. They have same action like macrolides. They bind to 23S subunit of 50S subunit of the ribosome and prevent the initiation complex between the 30S and 50S. They inhibit the formation of complex of 30S and 50S subunit of ribosomes for the protein synthesis. Clindamycin, it's a lincosamide class antibiotic. They bind to the 50th ribosomal subunit of the bacteria. And fluoroquinolones, they prevent they inhibit the DNA gyrase enzyme, thus preventing the relaxation of the supercoiled DNA before replication. So the DNA should relax, the supercoils should relax before the replication. So that process is inhibited by fluoroquinolones, and it prevents the DNA recombination, it prevents the DNA repair. Glycopeptides like vancomycin and teicoplanin, they prevent polypeptide synthesis, inhibit the peptidoglycan synthesis in the bacterial cell wall. They prevent the cross-linkage of the peptidoglycan chains, and thus inhibiting the formation of the bacterial cell wall, causing bactericidal effect. Metronidazole, they destabilize the DNA of the bacteria, and they are used as antibiotic, amiboside, and antiprotozoal. They cause, by inhibiting the bacterial DNA, they also cause molecular reduction of nitroso intermediates and sulfamides. So coming to the spectrum of antibiotics, we shall discuss first regarding the beta-lactams. Beta-lactam spectrum. Beta-lactams includes penicillins, carbapenems, and cephalosporins. So in the penicillins, there are natural penicillins, aminopenicillins, penicillins resistance penicillins, carbapenicillins, and uridopenicillins. So natural penicillins, penicillin G and penicillin B, these have more gram-positive coverage and less of gram-negative coverage. So gram-positive coverage, they have action against Streptococcus species, Enterococcus species, Listeria monocytogenes, Bacillus anthracis, and Corynebacterium bacteria. Coming to the gram-negative coverage, they have only coverage against Neisseria meningitis. And anaerobes, they have coverage against above the diaphragm Clostridium perfringens infections. And they inhibit sporochetes like Treponema pallidum and Leptospira species. So penicillin resistance antibiotics, these are some of the examples. Cloxacillin, decloxacillin, nafcillin, and methicillin, they have same gram-positive coverage as natural penicillins. They inhibit MSSA, methicillin sensitive staph aureus, methicillin sensitive staph epidermidis, and Streptococcus species. They have no activity against gram-negative bacteria. Aminopenicillins, amoxicillin, ampicillin, gram-positive coverage is of against Streptococcus species, Enterococcus species, Listeria monocytogenes, and Corynebacterium bacteria, same as the natural penicillins. And gram-negative coverage, it has some extended coverage against, some more coverage than natural penicillins. It inhibit Proteus mirabilis, Salmonella, Shigella, and some species of the E. coli, and Haemophilus influenza and Neisseria meningitis. And anaerobic coverage, it's same as natural penicillins. Carboxypenicillins, carbonicillin, and ticagrelin, gram-positive coverage is limited to Streptococcus and Corynebacterium bacteria, and gram-negative coverage, it has some good coverage against gram-negative bacteria. Proteus mirabilis, Salmonella, Shigella, E. coli. It has activity against Klebsiella species, some species of Klebsiella, Haemophilus influenza, Neisseria species, Enterobacter species, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It has activity against Citrobacter and Serratia macis. And anaerobic coverage, it has fairly good activity. So from comparing aminopenicillins and carboxypenicillins has some coverage against Klebsiella, Citrobacter, and Serratia macis. Uridopenicillins, piperacillin, azulacillin, and mesoacillin, they have same gram-positive coverage as natural penicillins. It covers Streptococcus, Enterococcus, and Listeria monocytogenes, and the gram-negative coverage same as carboxypenicillins, and it covers Klebsiella pneumonia, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and Enterobacter species. And anaerobic activity compared to the carboxypenicillins, it is same. So coming to the next class of beta-lactams, cephalosporins. So cephalosporins are divided into 5 generations: first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation. In this table, we can clearly see the classification of the cephalosporins. So first generation, cefazolin, cephalothin, and cephalexin. These are antibiotics which are commonly used. And second generation, cefotetan, cefamandole, and cefuroxime, cefaxetine, cefaclor. These are commonly used. And third generation, we commonly use ceftriaxone, cefalprozone, cefodoxime, ceftazidime, comes under third generation of cephalosporins, and fourth generation, which includes cefepime and cefpirone. Fifth generation, it includes ceftaroline and ceftabiprole. So as the generation of the cephalosporins increases, so they will have, apart from the gram positive coverage, there will be increasing gram negative coverage as the generation of the cephalosporin increases. So this picture, we can clearly see the coverage of a spectrum of activity of cephalosporins. So these have best activity against gram positive aerobes and limited activity against gram negative. As I said, as generation increases, there would be increased coverage of the gram negative bacteria. So gram positive bacteria, MSSA, Streptococcus species are covered, and gram negative bacteria, E. coli, some Klebsiella pneumonia have sensitivity against sensitivity with first generation cephalosporins, and some Proteus mirabilis, and Enterobacterus is also covered with the cephalosporins, first generation cephalosporins. So these are the second generation cephalosporins. So this picture clearly shows the coverage of extended cover, has a good coverage against gram negative than first generation. So it has coverage against E. coli, Klebsiella pneumonia, Proteus mirabilis, Haemophilus influenza, and Escherichia species. Anaerobic bacteria, these are covered with the cefoxitin and cefatitin. These have moderate anaerobic activity. So third generation, these are most commonly used as cephalosporins. So these includes ceftriaxone, ceftazidime, cefatoxime, cefpodoxime. So these have good coverage against gram negative bacteria and gram positive. So they have no coverage against anaerobic bacteria, and some spirochetes like Borrelia burgdorferi are covered with the third generation cephalosporins. So ceftriaxone and cefatoxime have best activity against methylcystis Staph aureus and Streptococcus species. Ceftazidime has less activity against MSS. And ceftazidime, cefpodoxime, and cefzoludine, they have activity against Pseudomonas. So these are anti-Pseudomonal cephalosporins. So fourth generation cephalosporins, these have extended spectrum of activity against gram negative. Has coverage against Enterobacteriaceae, including cephalosporinase producers. Some bacteria produce cephalosporinase. They inhibit the antibiotic. And gram negative coverage, it covers Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So fourth generation cephalosporins are anti-Pseudomonal cephalosporins. Cefepime and cefpirone. So this is the fourth generation cephalosporins. They have gram negative coverage against E. coli, Klebsiella species, Proteus species, Haemophilus influenza, and many other Enterobacteriaceae, and it has coverage against Pseudomonas. So as I said, anti-pseudomonal antibiotics are some some third generation cephalosporins and some fourth generation cephalosporins like ceftazidime, cefpodoxime, cefzoludine, and cefepime. Coming to the carbapenems, the next class of beta-lactams. These are the most broad spectrum of all antibiotics. They have activity against gram positive, gram negative aerobes, and has also activity against anaerobes. Has activity against Nocardia species, and rapidly growing mycobacteria are also covered by carbapenems. So what are not covered by carbapenems? MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph epidermidis, Enterococcus specium, Clostridium difficile, Stenotrophomonas maltophilia, Burgdorferi cepacia. These are not covered by the carbapenems. And ertapenem, it doesn't have activity against Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter species. So it has good gram positive and good gram negative coverage, and apart from it has some activity against anaerobes. It acts against Bacteroides fragilis. So BLBLI. So beta-lactam and beta-lactamase inhibitor. Some bacteria produce beta-lactamase which inhibit the beta-lactams. So these antibiotics with beta-lactamase inhibitors, they have coverage against beta-lactamase producing bacteria, like ampicillin sulbactam, oxacillin clavulinate, ticagrelin clavulinate, piperacillin tazobactam, cefoperazone sulbactam. So activity is against MSSA, Streptococcus species, and Enterococcus species, and beta-lactam is producing Enterobacteriaceae and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So what are anti-Pseudomonas cephalosporins? As I said in the previous slides, cefepime, ceftazidime, and carbapenems like meropenem, imipenem, and dorapenem, and BL, like piperacillin tazobactam and cephalosporin sulbactam. These have activity against Pseudomonas. So monobactams like azithromycin, they have good coverage against sorry, they don't have coverage against positive organisms. They have good coverage against gram negative. So they primarily bind to the PBB3 of in the bacteria, like Enterobacterus and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So these are weak beta-lactamase inducers. So aminoglycosides have good gram-negative coverage. It covers Enterobacterus, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Acinetobacter, and Francisella tularensis and Brucella species Yersinia pestis is also covered by streptomycin and gentamicin. Neisseria gonorrhea is covered by spectinomycin. So mycobacteria, aminoglycosides have activity against mycobacteria. Streptomycin, kanamycin, and amikacin covers mycobacteria. Streptomycin is the first line anti-tubercular drug, and non-tuberculous mycobacteria are covered with amikacin and streptomycin. So has these aminoglycosides have activity against gram-positive also. Staph aureus, Staph epidermidis, Streptococcus, and Enterococcus species are covered. Nocardia species is covered by amikacin. And coming to the glycopeptides like vancomycin and teicoplanin, these have good gram-positive coverage. So it has coverage against MSSA, MRSA, methylene-sensitive Staph epidermidis, and methylene-resistant Staph epidermidis, and has activity against PRSP, penicillin-resistant Streptococcus pneumonia. It is covered by vancomycin and teicoplanin. So has activity against gram-positive organisms like Streptococcus, Enterococcus. So glycopeptides, they don't have activity against gram-negative aerobes or anaerobes. So this bactericidal activity of gram-positive is for the above mentioned gram-positive organisms, except for Enterococcus species. Enterococcus species is not covered by glycopeptides. So glycopeptides, they are time-dependent bactericidal antibiotics. They have short post-antibiotic effect. So poor CSF and aqueous liver filtration. Daptomycin has a good coverage against gram-positive organisms. So has activity against MRSA, PRSP, VRE, vancomycin resistant enterococci are covered by daptomycin. So daptomycin is not active against gram-negative organisms. Streptogramins like quinquistin and dalfapristin have good activity against gram-positive organisms. So covers MRSA, PRSP, penicillin-resistant strep pneumonia, and VRE, vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. But it doesn't cover Enterococcus faecium. So rifamycins includes rifampicin, rifabutin, rifapentin, and rifaximin. So these have good activity against mycobacteria, so used as anti-tubercular drugs. So has activity against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, Mycobacterium avium complex, and Mycobacterium leprae. Has activity against staph, and has a gram-negative coverage against Haemophilus influenza and Neisseria meningitidis. So macrolide antibiotics, erythromycin, clarithromycin, and azithromycin, they have good activity against atypical organisms, chlamydia, mycoplasma species, Legionella pneumonia, and rickets. Some rickettsia species are covered with macrolides. And mycobacteria are also covered, Mycobacterium avium complex and Mycobacterium leprae. So these are used as a second line of anti-tubercular drugs. So has coverage against spirochetes, treponema, and Borrelia species. Has also some gram-positive coverage, covers some Staph aureus, but not MRS. Tetracycline antibiotics, doxycycline and tetracycline. In this picture, in slide, you can clearly see it has activity against some atypical organisms like Rickettsia and Chlamydia, and has activity against some Clostridium species, Borrelia burgdorferi, and Treponema pallidum. So gram-positive coverage has some coverage against Streptococcus pneumonia. Some species are covered with tetracyclines, and gram-negative Haemophilus and Neisseria. Enterobacter species are not covered with the tetracyclines. So quinolones, they have activity against the Mycobacterium species. So they are used as second line of anti-tubercular drugs. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, Mycobacterium avium complex, and Mycobacterium leprae are covered. Some gram-positive and gram-negative coverage. Many enterobacteria are covered with quinolones. So anaerobic coverage has some Clostridium species are covered and bacteroid species are covered. So in this picture, we can clearly see what all antibiotics have excellent activity and modest activity with gram-positive organisms, with gram-negative organisms, with atypical and anaerobic organisms. So coming to the gram-positive, excellent activity is with aminopenicillins plus beta-lactamase inhibitors. So, and extended spectrum penicillins plus beta-lactamase inhibitors like piperacillin tazobactam. And carbapenems have excellent activity against gram-positive. Vancomycin and daptomycin has excellent activity against gram-negative. So coming to the gram-negative organisms, extended spectrum penicillins plus beta-lactamase inhibitors, third and fourth generations, carbapenems, monobactams, aminoglycosides, quinolones, these all antibiotics have excellent activity against gram-negative bacteria. And anaerobic coverage, aminopenicillins plus beta-lactamase inhibitors like amoxiclav, these have good activity against anaerobic organisms. Extended spectrum penicillins plus beta-lactamase inhibitors like piperacillin tazobactam has good activity, excellent activity against anaerobics. Carbapenems, metronidazole, and chloramphenicol, these all antibiotics have excellent activity. And coming to the atypical organisms, modest activity is with macrolides and excellent activity is with tetracyclines and quinolones. So coming to the next topic, pharmacokinetics and dynamics of the antibiotics. So what is pharmacokinetics and what is pharmacodynamics? So pharmacokinetics is what the body does to the drug. So it includes absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination of the antibiotic. And pharmacodynamics refers to what the antibiotic does to the body and the organism, microorganism. So before going into the details of pharmacokinetics and dynamics, we need to know regarding some parameters like volume of distribution, clearance, elimination half time, and concentration maximum, concentration minimum, and loading dose. So volume of distribution, it is a ratio of dose present in the body to the plasma concentration when there is equilibrium between the tissues and plasma. And clearance is the volume of serum which is cleared of the drug per unit time. Elimination of time is the concentration, for the concentration to decrease to 50% of the peak concentration is elimination of time, and Cmax is the peak drug concentration achieved by a single dose, and Cminimum is the minimal serum drug concentration during the dosing period. So between the intervals of drug, what is the minimum dose, minimum concentration achieved? It's the C minimum. Loading dose. Loading dose is a volume of distribution into concentration of the drug in the serum. So, with this, by seeing the loading dose formula, it's a volume of distribution into serum concentration of the antibiotic. So the renal function, creatine clearance, has no role in the loading dose. So loading dose should not be adjusted for creatine clearance. So before going into detail of pharmacokinetics and dynamics, we need to know what all antibiotics are hydrophilic and what all antibiotics are lipophilic, hydrophobic antibiotics. So hydrophilic antibiotics are beta-lactams, aminoglycosides, vancomycin, linezolid, and colistin. So hydrophilic antibiotics, they do not go into the intracellular components because it's surrounded by lipid layers. So they are extracellular. They are predominantly in intravascular and extravascular spaces. So they have low volume of distribution. They have predominantly renal clearance and low intracellular penetration. So lipophilic antibiotics, in contrast, they have high volume of distribution because they penetrate into the intracellular compartments. High intracellular penetration will be there, and they will be predominantly hepatic clearance. So examples are fluoroquinolones, macrolides, clindamycin, and digitac. So what are the killing characteristics of antibiotics? So killing characteristics of antibiotics, antibiotics are basically classified into time-dependent killing of the antibiotics and concentration-dependent killing. And some antibiotics, they have both time-dependent, concentration-dependent with the time dependence. So what does it exactly mean? So time-dependent antibiotic means the dosage of antibiotics which is above the minimal inhibitory concentration. The duration for which the concentration of antibiotic is above the minimal inhibitory concentration. So if the duration is prolonged, then it will have a good killing characteristic. Whether it can be bactericidal, bacteriostatic, it will have a good bacteriostatic and bactericidal activity. Mostly the time-dependent antibiotics will be bacteriostatic. And coming to the concentration-dependent antibiotic, the killing power of the antibiotic is directly proportional to the concentration achieved after the dose of the antibiotic. So if the concentration max achieved is high, the killing power of the antibiotic is more. Mostly these antibiotics are bactericidal, and some bacteriostatic antibiotics are also there in this group. And concentration dependent with the time dependence, these antibiotics have both the components. They include the killing power of the antibiotic depends upon the concentration achieved after the dose and the time duration for which the antibiotic is stays more above the minimal inhibitory concentration. So these antibiotics have both the properties. So what are the examples of time dependent antibiotics? Beta lactams, carbapenems, linezolid, erythromycin, macrolides, and lincosamides. These are time dependent antibiotics. And concentration dependent antibiotics, aminoglycosides, metronidazole, fluoroquinolones, daptomycin, quinprisin, and dalfaprisin. These are concentration dependent antibiotics. And the concentration dependence with time dependence, like fluoroquinolones, aminoglycosides, some aminoglycosides, and azithromycin, tetracyclines. These have concentration dependence with the time dependence. Some antibiotics with the doses, their property may change from the concentration dependent to the concentration dependence with time dependence. So the parameters which are important for the antibiotic includes for the time dependent antibiotics that the time for which the serum concentration of the drug remains above the minimal inhibitory concentration of the antibiotic is important. So, and the concentration maximum achieved after a single dose of antibiotic is important for concentration dependent antibiotics. Area under curve is important for concentration dependence with time dependence antibiotics. So these all the antibiotic activity is good when the concentration is maintained above the minimum inhibitory concentration. So what is minimum inhibitory concentration? The lowest concentration of antibiotic that will inhibit the visible growth of the organism after overnight incubation. So what are the predictors of success? The Cmax Cmax to MIC ratio more than 10, and area under curve by MIC ratio more than 100. Time more than MIC of more than 40% of the dosing interval. So if you give meropenem at 8th hourly dosage, we usually give 1 gram IVTAD. So by Monte Carlo simulation studies, they have come with a conclusion that if the dosing interval, if the antibiotic is used as a continuous infusion, it will have a good time dependent killing of the antibiotic bacteria. So we can see the T-half formula and volume of distribution clearance formula. So in critically ill patients, what all pathophysiological alterations will affect pharmacokinetics? So in these patients, they will be having some patients may have increased volume of distribution. There will be decreased protein binding. Some patients they will have augmented renal clearance, reduced renal clearance, and hepatic dysfunction. So these all affects the pharmacokinetics of the antibiotics. So coming to the increased volume of distribution. So in sepsis patients, there may be capillary leak, edema formation, and some patients there may be third spacing. By fluid resuscitation, there may be increased volume of distribution. Extracorporeal circuits in ECMO patients, there will be increased volume of distributions to the extracorporeal circuits, and surgical drains, liver cirrhosis, fluid overload status, mediastinitis, and extensive burns. These all patients have increased volume of distributions. So increased volume of distributions is typically affects the hydrophilic antibiotics because lipophilic antibiotics they already have the increased volume of distribution because they penetrate the cell membrane of, they penetrate the lipophilic membranes of the cells. So they have good intracellular penetration, they have large volume of distribution. So those are not affected, but hydrophilic antibiotics, they usually have a low volume of distribution because they're confined to the extracellular components like intravascular and extravascular. So these antibiotics have, even in critical ill patients, there is increased volume of distribution. These hydrophilic antibiotics are affected. So these antibiotics needs increased loading dose. So increased volume of distribution doesn't affect lipophilic antibiotics. Coming to the protein binding, because of hypovolemia, there may be greater unbound drug proportion, increased tissue distribution, and there is a, because of hypovolemia, there is initial high target concentration of the Cmax of the antibiotic, but because of the increased volume of distribution, later fails to maintain the sufficient levels. So what is required in this hypovolemia? There is a requirement of large loading dose and frequent short dosing intervals or continuous infusion is required. So what are the highly protein bound antibiotics and hydrophilic antibiotics? These are most affected in hypovolemia, like ceftriaxone, etaperine, teicoplanin, daptomycin, and flucloxacillin. These are affected with hypovolemia. And augmented renal clearance is said when the GFR is more than 130 per body surface area, 130 ml per body surface area. So what conditions leads to the augmented renal clearance, like sepsis, burns, trauma, pancreatitis, autoimmune disorders, and major surgery? These have augmented renal clearance. So this leads to increased volume of distribution, and there will be insufficient antibiotic concentration. So what should be done? For time-dependent antibiotics, loading dose followed by continuous infusion is required. And for concentration-dependent antibiotics, as I said, concentration-dependent antibiotics is doesn't depend on the clearance, so it's barely affected by the augmented renal clearance. So, but Cmax is dependent on the volume of distribution, not on its clearance. That's the reason in augmented renal clearance, concentration-dependent antibiotics are less affected. And concentration dependent with time dependence, they are inversely related to the renal clearance. If renal clearance is increased, the killing characteristics of the antibiotics are decreased. So they need increased loading dose, and they need frequent dosing when there is augmented renal clearance. So in reduced renal clearance, like in patients with the AKA, CKD patients, and in patients requiring a renal replacement therapy, the dose modification is not needed unless and until the creatinine clearance is less than 50 ml per minute. So the dose concentration is reduced, or the loading dose is reduced, or frequency is reduced, depending upon the type of killing characteristics of antibiotic in reduced renal clearance patients. So for concentration dependent patients, what should be done? So the concentration dependent patients, it is better to prolong the dosing interval while maintaining the unmodified dose amount in order to maximize the Cmax by MIC ratio. So the initial loading dose should be same, but the interval should be prolonged. Like in aminoglycosides, we go with the same loading dose, but we decrease the frequency of it. We increase the time period between the drug dosing. So for time-dependent antibiotics, what should be done? So for time-dependent antibiotics, it is better to reduce the dose amount. The loading dose, the dose should be reduced, and the frequency of the drug should be unmodified. The dosing interval should be unmodified. In critical ill patients, this thing is to be noted. In critical ill patients, volume of distribution is often enlarged for hydrophilic antibiotics that distribute largely in the extracellular spaces, like aminoglycosides, beta-lactams, glycopeptides, and the cholesterol. This means that they will demonstrate reduced serum concentration when using standard loading dose. So apart from the renal clearance, we should always think of multiple elimination pathways of the antibiotic that may compensate for the decreased renal clearance. So that the standard reductions of the maintenance doses as recommended may potentially result in the substantial underdosing in critical ill patients. Because in AKI patients, there may be reduced renal clearance, but there may be increased volume of distribution of the drug. Thus, it may affect the standard doses of the antibiotics. So these includes ciprofloxacin, piperacillin, tazobactam, tigecycline, and cephalosporin. These are multiple elimination pathways. And how RRT affects the antibiotic concentration? So all various steps of RRT are very efficient in removing hydrophilic antibiotics, and in particular those with low protein bindings and high renal clearance. These antibiotics are affected with renal replacement therapy. So those drug levels will be decreased. They are eliminated fast through the renal replacement therapy through dialysis. So what should be done? So in these cases, we have to follow the therapeutic drug monitoring to optimize the appropriate antimicrobial dosing. So CRT, continuous renal replacement therapy. 30% of the ICU patients, they are in septic shock, they may require CRT. So adequate antibiotic dosing is essential for decreasing mortality and morbidity with sepsis. So complexity associated with underlying disease and their unpredictable impact on pharmacokinetic plays important role. See, in CRRT, there are multiple factors we have to take in account. The patients, coming to the patient factors, we have to see whether there is any residual liver function or renal function. We have to see whether there is hypoalbuminemia, whether there is increased volume of distribution or in fluid overload status, and we have to see the drug parameters like what is the molecular weight, volume of distribution, protein binding, and percentage of renal clearance of the drug. And coming to the CRIT factors, it depends also on the membrane factors, membranes, effluent, dialysate, and blood flow rates and ultrafiltrate. So these all affect the antibiotics. So for that reason, for some drugs, we need to have a therapeutic drug monitoring while the patients are on CRT. So this is a graph which shows that survival success is more when the effluent flow rate is between 20 to 40 ml per kg per hour on the CRT. So if it's decreased or else if it's increased, the flow rates are decreased or else increased, there is decreased survival. And coming to the how does obesity affect the drug dosing? So there will be increased volume of distribution. So the loading dose should be according to the actual weight, and the maintenance dose should be according to the adjusted body weight. Adjusted body weight is ideal body weight plus this is the formula shown down in the slide. Ideal body weight plus 0.4 into the actual body weight minus ideal body weight. So the initial loading dose should be according to the patient's actual weight, and there should be a cap on the doses. The doses should not limit the toxic dose. And then further maintenance doses should be according to the adjusted body weight. So these are the dosing schedules of some antibiotics on CRT. So we can see that amikacin loading dose is given as the loading dose unmodified 10 mg per kg, and when the patient is on hemodialysis, it's 7.5 mg per kg every 1 to 2 days. And vancomycin 15 to 25 mg per kg is the loading dose, and then on hemodialysis it's 1 gram every second day, and it's 1 gram every day in hemodiafiltration. So amikacin and vancomycin, these drugs requires therapeutic drug monitoring. So what does therapeutic drug monitoring mean? It is the analysis and interpretation of the drug concentration in the biological fluids. So what is it used for? It is used to maximize the efficacy and minimize the toxicity. So what all antibiotics needs therapeutic drug monitoring, like anti-cancer drugs, immunosuppressive drugs, cardiac drugs, anti-epileptic drugs, and some antibiotics like aminoglycosides and glycoproteins, like they need therapeutic drug monitoring. So coming to the liver dysfunction. So liver dysfunction it's because of processor, hepatocellular injury, ischemic hepatitis, or hemolysis, or direct damage from the hepatotoxic drugs. So hepatic impairment leads to the accumulation of the hepatically metabolized antimicrobials. So these are generally lipophilic drugs which have hepatic clearance. So these drugs are most effective with hepatic dysfunction. So the only antibiotics which dose reduction is for patients on childpox of liver failure are metronidazole, tigecycline, and caspofungin. So what does liver failure do? Liver failure often causes hypoproteinemia, hypovolemia, and then does increase the volume of distribution.
Karthik, we can't see your presentation.
I think there is some connection issue, sir. 1 minute.
Hello, sir. Disconnected. So coming to the hepatic dysfunction, for drugs like ciprofloxacin and which are renally as well as hepatic clearance, special attention needs to be given in whom hepatic dysfunction occurs. Yeah. Coming to the critical illness, there will be increased experience of the hydrophilic drugs with severe infection, trauma, burn injury, major surgery, and post-surgical drainage. So this flowchart.
Kishore, how many slides are there?
Yes, more slides. 3-4 slides. So
log out and re-log in. Log out and re-log in.
Yes. So coming to the pharmacokinetics and dynamics of antibiotics, beta-lactams, coming to beta-lactams, beta-lactams show continuous kill that is almost entirely related to So beta-lactams, they have time-dependent activity. So for cephalosporins, it should be 50 to 70% for cephalosporins and 50% for carbapenems and 40% for the carbapenems. So what does it mean? Means within the dosing interval, 50 to 70% of the dosing interval time, if there is infusion of the drugs like cephalosporins, penicillins, and carbapenems, will have a good time-dependent killing. So 50 to 70% of the dosing interval, that time period, the drug should be infused for cephalosporins, and for penicillins, it should be 50% of the 50% of the dosing interval. For that time period, the drug should be infused, and for carbapenems, 40% of the dosing interval for that time period, the drug should be infused, and then these antibiotics will have good time-dependent killing. So the most compelling support for that prolonged continuous infusion comes from the Monte Carlo simulation. Results of simulation consistently show that delivering beta-lactam antibiotics by infusion results in a greater number of subjects achieving the PK/PD target, particularly in the presence of pharmacokinetic variability common to the critical ill patients. In the graph, we can see that if the drug is infused over a period of time that is consistent with the percentage of the dosing interval, then adequate levels are achieved. For adequate time, the drug concentration is above the minimal limiter concentration. Cephalosporins, they have varying the protein binding from 10% to 98%, and largely confined to the extracellular compartment and poor intracellular concentration because they're hydrophilic antibiotics, and good CNS penetration will be there with the third and fourth generation cephalosporins. Carbapenems. Carbapenems, imipenem, meropenem, ertapenem, and doripenem. So imipenem is administered in combination with the cilastin. Cilastin is a specific enzyme inhibitor of renal dihydrogenase, which inhibits the metabolism of imipenem by kidney, thus increasing the T-half and decreasing the nephrotoxicity of the imipenem. So meropenem and ertapenem, these are primarily excreted by the kidneys. This doesn't require cilastin because the renal metabolism is negligible. So these antibiotics are more active against gram-negative bacilli and including the Pseudomonas species. The dosing of ertapenem is gram every 24th hourly, and meropenem is 1 gram every 8th hourly, and doripenem it's 500 mg every 8th hourly. So these are the examples of parenteral cephalosporins and beta-lactams. The dosing modification based on the creatinine clearance. So above 50 ml per minute of creatinine clearance, the dose doesn't need to be adjusted, and below that it should be adjusted. So this table clearly shows what doses to be given when there is a decreased renal clearance. So aminoglycosides, coming to the properties of pharmacokinetics and dynamics, it's a bactericidal antibiotic. It has concentration dependent, and it has post-antibiotic effect. Even after the antibiotic concentration is decreased below the minimum unit concentration, these drugs have antibiotic effect. So renal toxicity of the aminoglycosides in patients with impaired renal concentration, serum concentrations should be monitored to ensure safe and effective concentrations. The trough concentrations should be monitored in the aminoglycosides and vancomycins. The trough concentration should be monitored frequently in patients with fluctuating renal and cardiovascular functions. So the trough concentration is less than 9 microgram per ml, and when large doses are given at the intervals of 24 hours or greater. In patients with hemodialysis, approximately 2/3 to 3/4 of the dose is given. So it's 5 mg per kg of amikacin is required at the end of each dialysis session. And serum concentration, trough levels before dialysis, and peak concentration after supplement dose should be monitored. So recommended dose regimen of aminoglycosides the clearance. Here we can see that if it's a normal creatinine clearance above 80 ml per minute, the loading dose should be 7.5 to 10 mg per kg, and peak drug concentrations are 20 to 25 micrograms per ml, and the trough concentrations should be less than 10 or around 5 to 10. So when the in this we can see that clearly there is no change in the loading dose, and there is change in the frequency of the antibiotic administration. So vancomycin, it has time-dependent bactericidal activity, short post-antibiotic effect, protein binding of 30 to 55%, and it has poor CSF and aqueous penetration. So the peak serum concentration should be 30 to, it should not cross more than 40 micrograms per ml, and trough levels should be at the range of 10 to 50 micrograms per ml. So bolus versus continuous infusions of a vancomycin. Like beta-lactams, vancomycin also exhibits slow and time-dependent killing. However, unlike beta-lactams, these have moderate long post-antibiotic. And it has further shown that it actually has a concentration-dependent, time-dependent activity, not just a time-dependent activity. And thus it is inversely proportional to the creatine clearance. So when the creatine clearance is increased, the area under curve for 24 hours is decreased. Studies show that continuous infusion is cheaper, logistically more convenient, and achieves target concentrations faster and results in less variability of area under curve of 24 hours compared with the bolus dose. So thus the bolus dose is less effective than the continuous infusion. So dosage of vancomycin, here we can see that in concentration should be less than 5 mg per ml, and the rate should be less than 15 mg per minute, and dosage is normal in function is 30 mg per kg per day, and its hemodialysis dose is 15 mg per kg, and in high flux membrane used 20 mg per kg loading dose is used with 500 mg after each hemodialysis. So the hemodialysis dose for hemodialysis is 0.5 to 1.5 grams every 24 hours, and if hemodiafiltration is used, it's 0.8 to 1.75 grams every 24 hours. So cholesterol, the maintenance dose in renal failure is calculated by this simple formula: creatine clearance by 10 million units every 12th to 4th hour, 24th hour. So it should be followed by a 9 million loading dose. The loading dose is unmodified, and then the maintenance dose is calculated by this simple formula: creatine clearance by 10 million units every 12. So this slide shows the dose adjustment for critical illness patient for different antibiotics. Next, this flowchart shows the effect of pharmacokinetics and dynamics on different antibiotics. So hydrophilic antibiotics, as I said, these following aminoglycans, beta-lactams, glycoproteins, and lipoproteins. Tissue distribution is limited to the extracellular spaces because they're hydrophilic and they have predominant renal clearance. So in sepsis, there is need for increased dose, and there is need for increased or decreased maintenance dose depending upon the renal clearance. And lipophilic antibiotics, they have tissue distribution with intracellular accumulation. So they have predominant hepatic clearance. So there is no need for increased loading dose, and no need for maintenance dose adjustment in sepsis with renal. So this is the flow chart which shows the PKPD index for hydrophilic antibiotics. And here on the right left side we can see the time dependent antibiotics, and on the right side we can see the time dependence with concentration dependent antibiotics. So based on this flow chart, we can see whether the patient is a fluid overload, or whether the patient is having increased volume of distribution, and whether the patient is having increased or decreased clearance. Based on that, the drug dose, loading dose modification, and the maintenance dose of antibiotics can be changed. So based on this, following this simple flow chart, we can have an idea on what antibiotic dose to be administered and what changes should be made in loading dose and maintenance doses. And this is for lipophilic antibiotics. So following this flow chart, we can clearly make changes in the maintenance dose and loading doses of the antibiotics. So by this slide, I am completing my presentation. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Nandakishore, you want to add something?
To summarize it, sir, nothing major. It was an exhaustive presentation, but I just need to summarize as a total. While choosing an antibiotic, I think we all know today we are in an era of antimicrobial resistance. It has become a global problem, and resistant infections are being harder and harder to treat day by day. So to combat that, we need to have a decent knowledge about the basics of antibiotics.
There is a resound. Actually. Yes, these two systems are playing their own.
1 minute, sir. Yes, sir. 1 minute.
Yeah. Nice.
So, as we are in an era of antimicrobial resistance,
Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, please.
Yes, sir. Nothing much to add, sir. Just thinking of summarizing the entire thing. The main agenda of choosing this topic is every intensivist should have a basic knowledge about what antibiotic is using, what is the mechanism of action, what is the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic profile of the antibiotic. So, hope this class clears or throws a light on the basics of antibiotics, what to choose, how to choose an antibiotic infection. That will be dealt even more specific and clear in the next class. But today's is basically understanding the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic profile of various antibiotics which we use, their background mechanism of action. Uh, sir, nothing much to be addressed.
Ghanshyam?
Nothing much to add, Srinivas. See, antibiotics, though there is a whole lot of antibiotics which are available, I personally feel that it is becoming more and more difficult to choose antibiotics. One, because of the drug resistance. Other, in certain situations, the number of antibiotics which are actually available to treat particular infections is very less. So, until unless we start judiciously using these antibiotics, we are going to face a situation where the treatment options are going to be very, very minimal. So many a times an infection does not necessarily need the most broad spectrum or the most expensive antibiotic. If you can identify antimicrobial can work with that antibiotic, probably many a times we can get away with the simplest of antibiotics, right? That is something that is extremely essential in today. So that's the only thing that I would want to add.
Yeah. Agree with what you're saying. The highest spectrum or the highest, most expensive antibiotic is not always the most appropriate antibiotic. That's a point we need to take home from today's talk. The important thing I would like to add is while we have understood that there is a pharmacokinetic classification, there is a microbiological classification, we also need to understand lipophilic antibiotics and hydrophilic antibiotics, what is their significance? Important thing is about the volume of distribution. When patients get large volume fluid resuscitation, or they are in a phase of augmented renal clearance, like the hydrophilic antibiotics have lower therapeutic levels than the lipophilic antibiotics. When you are dealing with infections of the CNS, lipophilic antibiotics seem to have a better penetration into the meninges, leptomeninges, and the CSF than hydrophilic antibiotics. The other classification, which I think should be very important for us, is about antibiotics with a high therapeutic index and antibiotic with a narrow therapeutic index, where the difference between the minimum effective dose and the high lethal or the toxic dose is very small. And one of those drugs is polymyxin B, where the difference between the minimum effective dose and the toxic dose is very, very small. So you need to be very, very careful in titrating this drug, probably also phosphorylates. So the understanding, Nandakishore said every intensivist should have basic understanding about antibiotics. I think this understanding about antibiotics of intensivists should so go beyond basics. We should be very thorough with the dosing of antibiotics because we deal with patients on extracorporeal circuits. We deal with patients with varying volumes of distribution in a given day, and we deal with patients who get multiple other drugs which have interactions with antibiotics. So, as intensivists, our knowledge should be of antibiotics should be second to none. as it is with other aspects of medicine. So one of the problems, as Ghanshyam said, is MDR and XDR bugs, and how to handle them, what antibiotics to choose for what resistance is something we will cover next week. And don't miss that, because that will be dealt with by Nanda Kishore, who is very emotional and passionate about antibiotic stewardship. So please do log in next week. That will be moderated by Ghanshyam, again another advocate for very strict discipline in the use of antibiotics. So thank you all. We'll meet you again next week.